Thank you, Kieran. And first of all, with that introduction and warm-up, hopefully not everyone is exhausted because it's a lot of publications, as you can see and mention, right? So there's a lot going on. So hopefully in our, I see the first slide, there's change in there, but maybe you can move to the next slide, Kieran, there as I'm not going to cover climate change, right? So when Kieran mentioned environment and what's going on, I'm going to cover the overall update of the SEC here and try to give you a little bit of an overview of all these publications that Kieran just mentioned, so then you can, we can answer questions or you can direct for more details in some of those publications. So I always think at this time, first, it's starting with the general tone, right? Because it's great. There's a lot of like guidance and publication, but why, right? What is going on? So first, always, the SEC mission is really to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, facilitate the capital formation, and the mission is really unchanged, and circumstance and approach shift from, however, from one to the other, right? So the chair of the SEC, Gary Gensler, has a very investor-focused agenda. And we noted a significant change in the tone, right? So in general, I expect more rules and more specific rules versus relying on principle-based concepts that we have seen with already with the proposed rules. We have seen as well the SEC tackling aggressively areas of potential investor harm and looks for greater transparency, like the SPAC, the cryptocurrency. So there's a really big push on transparency, tackling difficult issues like that, protecting investors. So that's generally the tone of the top. And Gary Gensler has an agenda as well that is very politically influenced as well, right? So we'll talk about the climate change, the push that is on that. So more rules, as you can see, and that's why we have so much going on. With that, I thought maybe, and then you can see the changes in phases here, right? So more on climate change, digital assets, cybersecurity, board governance, right? You mentioned the governance, capital raising, less regulatory exemptions, however, so more rules and more. And for this audience, right, there's as well a lot less FPI exemptions, I guess, in general. So most of the rules are going to apply similarly to FPI, or almost similarly to FPI, than they are for domestic. So with that, I thought as well, I would just highlight some of the recent discussion, which was at the SEC conference. So if we go to that next slide, there was the SEC, what we refer to the SEC conference, so the 2022 IACPA conference, and there were a few developments. The conference gathers, representatives from the SEC, the PCAOB, the FASB, the IASB, and other market participants, companies, auditors, and so it's a great 3 full days of updates and developments. So from being there, first I will say that it was great to see how many people were back in person and great discussions and developments, including the SEC and all the different participants. It was held mid-December, so not that long ago, and I can't cover in all the details what was talked about, but I am happy to take as well questions and will highlight, though, some of the recurring themes. So first of all, definitely need for more transparency and the impact of the current uncertainty environment on judgments, estimate, and critical accounting principles. So I mentioned the tone of the top, and you can see it was transcribed by a lot of discussion on how it should be reflected, right? More transparency, how you're sensitive, and you mentioned inflation as well. How is that uncertainty environment disclosed and reported in disclosures? The SEC, as well mentioned, with the uncertainty comes increased need to more robust discussion on MD&A, critical account estimate, sensitivity disclosure, or having numbers associated with that, dollar signs in the discussion. Board governance and related disclosure was a key theme. Auditor independence with SEC and PCAOB focus. So, and Diana, I'm sure we'll give you a couple of updates later. Of course, a lot of non-GAAP discussions. So the SEC announced the update on the CDNI, so the compliance disclosure interpretation, at the conference with on non-GAAP financial measures. So I know it's a topic, I get a lot of questions, and we can, discuss some of that. The updates were, however, really intended to memorialize their existing views of the staff as provided before on public statement, comment letters. So they wanted to make sure that's not considered new guidance, but it's, just clarifying, right, what their view is and putting that on paper. So the guidance are really on, what is considered misleading, clarification of normal and recurring adjustments. So an example, right, I always think a quick example is good. The SEC provided the example of the cost of opening a new store location in the retail industry. So if you're in retail and you're opening a new store, would that be, can you argue that remove the cost as a non-GAAP adjustment to opening, to your results? But the SEC said now this is considered normal and recurring, given that opening and closing stores are part of your retail business strategy and revenue generating activities. So that gives the point there. So other updates on the CD&I were related to the labeling of the non-GAAP and what adjustments. I mentioned one of the key focus is crypto assets. So the SEC discussed that they have quite a few consultations on crypto asset transactions. They acknowledge that, while there's some existing accounting model to look at, there's no specific guidance that it directs and addresses these transactions. So they spent a lot of time discussing what the accounting for anyone having a crypto asset. And they emphasize, though, that there's unique transaction, unique risk and uncertainties associated with that. So this is very important to, again, transparency about the accounting and what the risk and uncertainties are. So you may have seen that there's been a lot of enforcements on related to cryptocurrency, and maybe that's a good thing there to put an update quickly on enforcement. The SEC, there was quite a few updates at the conference on enforcement, and they announced that they had for 760 approximate enforcement action in the fiscal year 2022, which is an increase of 9% from prior year. So, and always we like numbers just to give a sense, right, of how much money that gets from civil penalties, disgorgements, and interest. It's $6.4 billion. So that's the most record on SEC history. And it's up from $3.8 billion from fiscal year 2021. So that gives you a sense. Definitely enforcement has been active, and they are putting a point on that. I said as well that there is a lot of, new rules and proposals that are getting there, as we mentioned originally. You mentioned ESG and climate change, so Val is here with us. We'll cover all that details. Cybersecurity has been discussed briefly there. It's a lot less controversial rule. We are expecting that to be finalized, hopefully in June. And this is really, again, giving guidance on more consistency of disclosures and transparency about cybersecurity incidents, and when there is a material impact to the company, to make sure that it's disclosed timely and that there is a recurring disclosure that goes with it in your annual reports. One that you mentioned that seems that in your poll, Kirian, not that many people have started looking at, and I started seeing more question and debate around it. This is actually an adopted rule this time, not a proposed rule, but that was mentioned there, which is the clawback rule. So what is the clawback? So in October 22, the SEC adopted that rule, and it directs really the stock exchange, so the Securities Exchange, to establish standards for issuers, so all our companies here, to develop and implement a written policy to recovery or clawback the incentive-based compensation received by a current or former executive officer over a 3-year period in the event of a required accounting restatement. So you're going to say, okay, how does that impact me and when, right? So the final rule, the way it works is that the stock exchange have to adopt the standards there and develop. But they have a year from when it was adopted. So really we expect, what does that mean? We expect company will be required to implement that clawback policy by the end of 23 or early 24, depending on there. And the 2023 financial statement may be affected by the new disclosure requirement. We're expecting that it will be. So that's a lot, big debate, big like picture of a lot of what was discussed in the at the conference. Yeah, go for it, Karen.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I always find strange is the conference is the AICPA conference, so it's basically the American accountants. But it seems like who speaks most at this conference is the SEC, and this is one of the major, I guess, forums which the SEC uses to express its views. And you have all of these other, like the PCOB, ISB, so you have a lot of other bodies there. And I guess this seems, but this seems to be one of the principal, I guess, forums that the SEC expresses. When I say expresses its views, they always have those disclaimers at the start of the conversations. But it's something that everyone seems to keep their eye on for the position of the SEC for the year.
Yeah, it's a great point, Kieran. It's not just the SEC there, right? But so it's interesting because it was well the other participants, auditor, restaurants, what's happening there. But it's a great forum, yes, to it's usually not that many surprises there, right? We have seen during the year, but it's a good like summary of all the views and speakers. And to your point, it's a great forum to communicate and memorialize some of the views there. And this year they announced the CD&I during the conference on the non-GAAP. So that's, usually it's not too many new rules or new like guidance associated with. And they put in there that it was not new per se, but they still issued that time. So it's a great forum to your point. And that's why it's a good thanks to just summarize some of the discussion because it gives you the highlight and fastest for the reporting period. And it's close to, when we all start discussing the reporting here.
Yeah. I guess the other thing on the clawback provision, so companies, even FPIs, need to adhere to this provision. So they need to change their incentive plans.
So I don't know that they need to change the incentive plans, but to your point, and that was part of the reason I'm mentioning there that there's not less exemption on anymore for FPI. So the clawback provision applies to foreign private issuers. There will be some, potential nuance on how to, apply and like how to claw back and, depending on the law and regulation of each country. So there might be some challenges. But yes, it applies to everyone. And then they will have to have a policy if they don't have how it is. And it's only, as well when there is the clawback will happen when there is restatement, and we can go in more details later on that. But yes, it applies to everybody.
Okay, great, thanks. I see there's a lot of new regulations, so I won't hold you back anymore.
That sounds good. So next, maybe one thing I wanted to mention as well, which it was discussed at the conference. And if you go to the next slide, Kieran, it's on the, that was the clawback. We can move to the next one on the, as we cover, on materiality. That was mentioned there, but I think it was as well a separate speech from the chief accountant, Von Manter, at that point acting and now chief accountant. And I think it's important because we all get, especially a year-end here, with materiality, right? And so what is it and what it means? And I think that's a good reminder for the speech, and I recommend if you haven't read it to look at that speech as well. But it's a good reminder on how to assess whenever there's errors that are identified, right? So at the time of identifying an error, first of all, management and auditors will need to evaluate those errors under the SEC guidance and document their assessment, oftentimes as what we refer in the SEC as a Sub 99 memo. So this reference, right, the quantitative and qualitative factors in determining the impact of the errors identified to the financial statement user. So Sub 99 really lists you some of the qualitative factors management should consider. But, you have to really think like restatement of the earnings trends, the failure to meet analysis consensus, change of loss to versus income, or some of the ones that, as qualitative you have to assess. The point that is the speech and that we have to remind people, and we've seen that through, the issues through common letters as well, is that people just think that when it's quantitative material, they can look at the qualitative factor to say maybe it was not a material error. It's not the point there. I think it's more what he was saying is actually if people should think differently and kind of almost the reverse. It could be quantitatively immaterial, but because of the qualitative factor, it could become material. So I think it's a very important point that he believes it's very rare, and in my experience, it's very rare that if you have an error that is quantitatively material, that you can compensate with qualitative factor. So if it is a quantitative, so in a summary, right, if it's quantitatively material, then very likely it's a material error. And then if it's quantitatively immaterial, but maybe it impacts because of qualitative other aspects that you have to go through, it might still be material. So something very important to not forget as we are preparing and reporting here and looking at sums. And maybe to close my few initial remarks, I will just give you one of the other things I mentioned. That was one that we've seen in the comment letter. But if we go to few of the what's happening in the comment letter, slide there, Kieran, on the IFRS comments. So this is the, oops, you're going the other way around. Yep. So a few things I want to mention here. In general, and they mentioned it at the conference as well, but what I do is I look at the trends for the last 12 months on IFRS filers. And in general, the topics are very similar between US GAAP and IFRS filers because, as you may know, the review process for the annual report is in fact done by the same people at the SEC. So they're doing, it's more by industry, and they're going to look at domestic and FPI by the same people and the same person. That being said, there's still some nuances for FPI and IFRS filers. So the 5 more frequent areas include revenue, non-GAAP, we just mentioned, there's some clarification and we've seen a lot of comments on that, segments, business combination, and share-based compensation. It remains consistent, but what we have seen is a change in position. So non-GAAP and segments have actually been up. And not on the top 5 yet, but I've started to see more comments on that. It's on MD&A. So generally, it's a common area where, the SEC has been starting to ask to be a lot more precise and quantified, provide more change explanation in the MD&A, quantifying prices, volume changes related to the revenue, for example, or what is inflation, driven, what is more like conflict of Ukraine or Russia or something else, right? So I'm starting to see a trend. So it's not in the numbers, but I want to mention here. The other thing I want to mention is I just mentioned, Russia, Ukraine, and the SEC actually has 2 sample letters that are very consistent with the comments we have seen coming. And so I recommend people to, as part of their reporting process, to really make sure they look at those. So it's the sample letter of, on Russia invasion of Ukraine and related supply chain issues, and then the sample letter regarding climate change disclosure. And we provide the link as well for that. And finally, on non-GAAP, I mentioned non-GAAP was really up, and then on segments. So on the non-GAAP, it's very similar to the new CAD&I, and the comments really include things around misleading, individual retailers, measures, prominence, and labeling is very important. In the FPI world, I've still seen, which is a difference with the domestic, a lot more comments on the labeling. So for example, a non-GAAP should not be labeled if first it should be labeled and it should be clearly labeled within the disclosure as a non-GAAP, but 2, it should really represent what is there. So you may know EBITDA, as a quick example, is one that is defined by the SEC. And if you are not doing the regular EBITDA as expecting in the US, it should be called something else, adjusted EBITDA, something else, right? So that's for example. Misleading, it's been a lot of focus on what adjustments you can make or not make around it, right? So you can't really recreate accounting, first of all, and then 2, the adjustments are really debits and credits from the books. And finally, I mentioned the example with recurring and non-recurring, and we can go in more details on that as if people people are interested. It's important that it cannot create something else than, it cannot be misleading, and there could be a review of that. Finally, I think with that on segment reporting, just quick notes there, Kieran, I think the few things I've seen on segment reporting, there's been a lot of challenge in general of like if companies have only one segment. So the SEC has been, asking more about that. If there is aggregation, to be very clear on aggregation, there's been a lot of changes, in companies with their COVID reorganization, and the SEC made the point again, even at the conference as well. They read and listen to the investor calls. They look at the rest of the, press release. And if you're disclosing differently, than what you have in your segments, you will get questions there. And finally, if you have one reporting, you have more than one performance measure in your segments, the SEC has been challenging that there should be really one that is the closest to the external reporting. That should be the one you have in your F pages in your financial statement. So segment reporting and non-GAAP still be key focus and trend that I'm seeing. So that's what I had, Kieran, for the first big overview here.
Great. I guess thanks very much for that, Ghislaine. And I guess now we move to Valerie to tell us a bit about the SEC climate proposal. There's much talked about, much awaited SEC climate proposal.
It is, and so maybe I will start with our expectation of the proposal. The SEC issued what's called a regulatory flexibility agenda, or their Reg Flex agenda, which is a list of the rules and proposals that they expect to issue in the coming 12 months. There were 29 rules that they expect to issue that were identified as final rules in the coming 12 months. They listed 21 of them as being released in April of 2023. So obviously that's not really feasible that all of the rules would be issued in the same month. Actually, based on process, by the time the agenda was made public, 5 of those rules had actually already been issued, including, as Ghislaine discussed, the clawback rule. So the way we look at that timing is more of a short-term or long-term or first half of 2023 versus the second half. So we do expect the climate rule, the cyber rule, the human capital rules for SEC reporters to impact, to be released in the coming weeks. My personal view is early March. I've heard some guesses as mid-February, but we would definitely expect in this first quarter to see a final rule. And when I get to the end, I'll talk to you about what that means as far as a phased implementation. So I wanted to go over the details of the proposal, and I'll try to highlight some of the areas where we expect the final rule to differ from the proposal. And again, this is just my perspective based on what we're hearing from some of the public statements that are made. And we really are just anxiously awaiting the final rule to determine what those requirements will be. But starting with the disclosures outside of the financial statements. These are similar, but definitely not the same as some of the other international requirements. If you look at the International Sustainability Standards Board or the European sustainability standards under the CSRD or Corporate Social Reporting Directive in the EU. But all of them are based on a framework established by the Task Force for the climate-related financial disclosures. The TCFD has 4 pillars of, it refers to metrics, governance, risk, and strategy. And you'll see all 4 of those echoed throughout these disclosures. In the disclosures outside of the financial statements, it starts with a focus on strategy and risk. There, the registrant is required to disclose the climate-related risks that are reasonably likely to have a material impact on the financial statements over the short, medium, and long term. Now, there's a lot of detail in there, Starting with the word material, Ghislaine spoke about some of the assessments of materiality. This is intended to be traditional financial statement materiality as you would normally consider it, so more from an investor perspective. It is also over the short, medium, and long term, which again, the further out you get, the harder it is to evaluate. The climate-related risks need to be segregated between the physical and the transition risks. Physical risks are a little bit easier to get your head around. Those are ones that are chronic or acute and are related to the physical security of assets and operations, the exposure to climate-related events. Now, the physical risks, the only question is that, so not the only question, but one of the questions is that disclosure needs to be at a zip code level of detail on the location of the assets and the operations that are subject to that risk. So the zip code level is more of a US construct, but general in international locations would be some sort of a regional postal code area, generally aligns with your mailing address. So though that level of detail was questioned in the responses to the proposal, some thought that most people who referenced it thought that it was too granular and perhaps something more regional would be sufficient. In addition, there are enhanced disclosures for assets and operations that are in flood hazard areas or high or extremely high water stress, wherein the registrant would need to disclose more detail about the risks and the assets exposed to that detail. And in the case of water stress, the percentage of water that is drawn for the company worldwide from areas designated as high water stress. In addition to the risk disclosures, there are disclosures about greenhouse gases. Now, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are required for all registrants. Scope 1 being your direct greenhouse gas emissions. Those are emissions of 7 designated gases, including carbon dioxide. Scope 2 are purchased emissions. So those are the emissions based on the purchase of electricity, heating, cooling, steam, etc. Those disclosures are required in year 1, but will eventually be subject to third-party attestation for large accelerated and accelerated filers. And we'll get into the phased-in approach in a few slides. Scope 3 emissions, which are indirect emissions related to your upstream and downstream value chain. That means on the upstream side, anyone in your supply chain that supports your operations. On the downside of your value chain would be your customers and the end of life of products that are sold, for example. The Scope 3 is only required if it is material or if it is included in a target or goal that is issued by the company. So, for example, if the company has committed to net zero or to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, that would scope in all of your Scope 3 emissions for disclosure purposes. You also need to disclose whether you have one of those targets. Now, in certain other requirements, you're required to have a target for reduction. In the SEC's rules, you are only required to disclose a greenhouse gas or other climate-related target if you have one. So it's not an obligatory disclosure. It's only if you have one, they're establishing a degree of accountability by making you disclose the target, how you're going to achieve the target, as well as your progress toward that target. In addition, there are governance and management disclosures about how climate risks are identified, assessed, and managed, including some enhanced disclosures about who is responsible among the board for the oversight of climate-related risks. Is it a committee? Is it an individual? There is also a required disclosure of whether anyone on your board has climate-related risk expertise. Although different from when you need a financial expert on your audit committee, different from the proposal for a cybersecurity expert, this proposal really does not define what it means to be a climate risk expert, and that's left to a degree of judgment. I'll move on now to the financial statement disclosures. This was also, I'd say, criticized or discussed in the comment letter process. I'll mention that there were over 15,000 comment letters that were issued or submitted to the SEC in response to the proposal. The bulk of that number, about 11,000, were actually form letters. Those were letters that were written by one person and submitted by up to 6,000 or 7,000 people. And those letters generally were only a sentence or two long. The other component of the responses, a lot of them came from individuals, from students, from individual investors. That was another 2,000 or 3,000. So the substantive letters, there were actually about 1,000 letters that we analyzed that came from companies and not-for-profits and government entities. There was a lot of question about the footnote requirements because it's only the SEC disclosures. If you think about the big three frameworks, meaning the European model, the ISSB, and the SEC, which we refer to as the big three, only the SEC requires footnote disclosure. Now, in the SEC proposal, the footnote disclosures, you're required to include the financial impact of severe weather events and other natural conditions on the individual financial statement line items in your footnotes. So that includes anything that impacts your balance sheet, your income statement, your cash flow statement at an individual line item level. And the threshold for reporting is 1%. So when I mentioned the response letters that came from companies and investors, anyone who mentioned the threshold thought that 1% was way too low, that was just not operable, including PwC. In our response letter to the proposal, we identified that as not really being a practical threshold, as well as potentially including information that was not useful for investors. And the ultimate target of the disclosure would be for the ability of investors to make decisions. And we thought that threshold was too low. In addition, that 1% would be applied to expenditures. So you would need to include expenditures. So think about cash flows that were used to mitigate the risk of severe weather events and also mitigate exposure to transition risks. So the risks of transitioning to a lower carbon economy, as well as the cash flows to meet climate commitments. Those would be based on 1% of the total costs capitalized or 1% of the total expensed costs. So again, from a cash flow standpoint, you would need to evaluate separately those costs that are capitalized and those that are expensed and include appropriate disclosure. There's also a requirement to disclose the impact on estimates and assumptions. Those are qualitative descriptions about how the risks and uncertainties of severe weather events would impact the estimates and assumptions that support the financial statements. Now, one thing I'll mention is you may have noticed a difference when I spoke about the SK requirements versus the SX requirements. This is primarily focused on severe weather events versus climate events. The footnotes don't mention climate risk. It is basically taking the judgment out of the hands of the corporation in determining whether a severe weather event is caused by climate change. So the disclosure is based on the occurrence of severe weather events, which honestly is not defined, although they do give examples, including hurricanes and floods and drought conditions. The assurance requirements for the footnotes, because they are in the footnotes, they would be subject to internal control over financial reporting or your controls testing, both from a management perspective and an auditor perspective, if that's applicable, as well as would be covered by the audit opinion, not individually, but obviously in the context of the audit taken as a whole. So if I move on to the transition to the rules. Now, these dates are the dates that were included in the proposal. Those are no longer feasible. This is purely an example of how the phased-in approach was included in the proposal. So in the proposal, they assumed that the rules would be issued in 2022. So I kept the dates here only because, as I said, it helps in order to understand, based on your filing status, how those rules were proposed to be phased in. So in the first year, For large accelerated filers, you would need to include, well, basically for any filer, the first year would be a disclosure of your scope 1, your scope 2 emissions, as well as all of the other disclosures about your climate related risks. The following year, you would include your scope 3 disclosures for those who are required to include them. From an assurance standpoint, the first year of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are disclosed only. In year 2, they are subject to limited assurance, basically the equivalent of a review of that information. That would be applicable for year 2 and year 3. Following that, the SEC has suggested that it transitions to reasonable assurance, which is basically an audit of those emission disclosures. Again, only the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and only your large accelerated and accelerated filers. So those would be subject to audit in basically year 4 of the disclosure. As I mentioned, we expect the rule to be released soon. We do not expect it to be effective for 2023. It is possible that it would be required for large accelerated filers in 2024. So those would be the 20Fs, or the financial statements that are submitted in 2025. So clearly would still be an aggressive target and a lot of work in preparation for the large accelerated filers once we know that the rule has been released. And just quickly in the last minute that I have, want to talk about the practical steps, because we get a lot of questions about how companies are preparing for the final rules. The first step really is to assemble a cross-functional team. And this is almost unprecedented, the scope that you need to look at. So we would expect that at the table, you would need to have people from financial reporting, from SEC reporting, sometimes investor relations, your sustainability teams, your counsel. There are a lot of people who will have an impact on how these disclosures are presented. You also need to understand the requirements of the rules and determine the applicability. So it's important to understand if you are in the scope of the SEC rules, as well as the European and the ISSB international rules as well. Those disclosures vary. The CSRD scope is much broader than just climate, as is the ISSB. And so it's important to understand what's required, and then to create an inventory of your current disclosures and compare that to the requirements to identify any gaps in your reporting. You also want to look at the controls process and create a project plan to come to compliance. Some of the concerns, and definitely one of the first steps we're seeing, is external reporting and SEC reporting being more involved in a company's sustainability reports or corporate sustainability reports. Those disclosures often did not include involvement from external reporting. And in some cases, as I mentioned, some of the disclosures that you make in a sustainability report may impact what's required in your SEC filing. So if they are making commitments, you would need to know that for your SEC reporting purposes. In addition, there are current SEC rules, and some of you may have seen comments from the Division of Corporation Finance in the comment letter process, as Ghislaine mentioned. Climate change letters have not cracked the top 5 for foreign private issuers, but it has become a top 5 issue for domestic issuers. And in our experience, the focus for domestic issuers will eventually move toward foreign private issuers and be focused there. So the SEC is currently focused on the disclosures relative to the current securities laws, meaning that the disclosure of risk in the financial statements, your risk factors, would need to consider climate risk today. There are also questions that the SEC is asking about disclosures in sustainability reports and about why, if they are material for disclosure there, they're not included in the SEC filing. So as I said, one of the key steps the companies are taking is a little bit more focus on those sustainability reports. So Kieran, maybe I will pause there if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will turn it back to you for the PCOB section.
Yeah, I guess every time we pass through this proposal, I'm just dumbfounded by the volume and the detail of this proposal. And it's 500 pages of proposal just on climate. It just seems like a huge piece of regulation and a huge challenge for companies, especially considering the timeline that they're proposing. At least, if it just moved that timeline forward 1 year, even so, like it seems like it's just a huge challenge for registrants.
That's what we would expect. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. Well, thanks very much, Valerie. I think next is Diane. Diane, maybe you want to tell us about the PCOB and regulatory updates. Maybe the PCOB hasn't made any regulatory change and
Yeah, probably not anything quite as significant as what we saw in the climate change or what could be coming down in the climate change proposal. But I appreciated the survey that you put up at the very beginning, because one of the questions was on the PCOB. And as Rodrigo and I talk about the PCOB, we'll try to answer some of those questions. Now, I do recognize that the PCAOB may not be a regulatory body that a lot of companies follow, because it does regulate auditors, and so it might be something that you're only slightly familiar with. Many of you do follow it on a regular basis, so we'll talk a little bit about it today. You can see the board members are up, and I'll give you some reasons why we put them up. So we'll go through a high-level understanding of the PCOB first, just in case you're not following it, and then we'll talk about some of the recent activities. So just as a reminder, the PCAOB, it's now over a decade old, almost 20 years old, and it was created by the US Congress through the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And as most of you know, that SOX Act was in the wake of these accounting scandals involving companies like Enron, Xerox, and WorldCom, which revived these really longstanding concerns about auditor effectiveness, independence, and governance over the auditing profession. And if you are keeping up with news from the PCAOB, you may have heard that about a year ago, the SEC appointed a new chair to the PCAOB, along with 3 other board members. So that's where we're really going to start this discussion today, is by reviewing those changes in the board. So I've got the current board members up on the screen here. The board is led by 5 full-time board members, each of whom is appointed to the SEC for a 5-year term. And then the PCAOB chair, who you can see on the screen, is Erica Williams. She is appointed by the SEC chair and their commissioners. And this is slightly different than how the SEC is set up, because the SEC chair is appointed by the President of the United States. And this means that typically that SEC chair is going to change each time there's a new president elected by the US voters. However, the PCAOB chair and the other board members, typically they only change when their 5-year term expires. So they write out their 5-year term, and then a new appointment will come in. But in the first half of 2021, and this was shortly after the change in the US president, various parties wrote to the newly appointed SEC chair, Gary Gensler, and they were very critical of the PCAOB. Some of the letters called for Chair Gensler to replace the PCAOB chair or the whole board. And those letters, the criticism in those letters, were primarily focused on this perceived lack of transparency. They didn't like that enforcement actions had gone down. They didn't like that the PCAOB's budget had gone down, and there were some concerns on the rigor of their inspections. And so in June of 2021, so a few months after that, the SEC chair announced that the commission had voted to remove the chair and to install Dwayne Disparts, he was part of the board at that time. And so he was to become the acting chair. And then they said that they're going to seek candidates for all 5 positions on the board. And then later that year, towards the end of the year, the SEC chair and commissioners got appointed 3 new board members and the chair, Erica Williams. So Dwayne Disparts is the only member that stayed on. So that just sets the stage on the changes which happened in the PCAOB over a little over a year ago. And then since that time, we've been seeing increasing activities from the board, largely around some of these criticisms that they had. And we've also seen this increase in enforcement actions. So Rodrigo and I will talk about them a bit because we think you might find those interesting. So Chair Williams, she has not been shy of the activities of the board over her time as chair. And she summarized these activities in a speech that she gave in September. You can see those highlights on the screen. There are increased sanctions of audit firms and individuals. There's significant increase in penalties, including breaking the record of the largest monetary penalty for an individual. And then she also mentioned that they're assessing penalties 100% of the time. Previously, it was less than that.
Diana, clearly the body has been stepping up their activities in the monitoring of auditors. There is another point that I think would be helpful for residents to know related to sanctions of the audit firms or persons. Typically, in the PCAOB audit disciplinary matters, the PCAOB doesn't mention the name of the registrant upon which the auditor's violation occurred. However, over the past year, we are seeing an increase in registrants being named in the public release of the disciplinary actions in that auditors.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Rodrigo. And so another reason to maybe pay attention to what the PCAOB is doing, because if your auditor has an issue, it could result in the registrant's name for which they were auditing to also be included in those public releases. In addition to the sanctions, the PCAOB also regulates audit firms through inspections. And the PCAOB inspects auditors. It's either on an annual basis or once every 3 years. And that time frame really depends upon the number of U.S. registrants that are audited by the firm. And the most notable reason that the PCAOB can affect registrants is related to these inspections. Because if the PCAOB comes in, inspects an audit firm, and they determine that that during that inspection, when they looked at what the auditor had done, the audit procedures that they performed weren't done correctly, or they weren't sufficient, or evidence that they obtained wasn't sufficient, then it will issue an inspection comment to the audit firm. And when those audit firms receive the inspection comments, they have to remediate the issues identified, which often means performing additional procedures, including obtaining additional evidence from the registrant to verify the financial statements are complete and accurate, or if they have issued an opinion on internal controls, that those controls are designed and operating effectively, and that opinion on those controls was correct. During that remediation time, the auditor can't issue another audit opinion or issue any of their consents. So that remediation period can delay a registrant's ability to access the public market because that auditor can't consent to having their audit reports included in prospectus filings or another annual or other annual reporting.
That's right, Diana. And another consideration is what impact this remediation could have on the financial statements. During the remediation, when the auditors perform the additional re-audit procedures, they could determine that the financial statement amounts are materially incorrect or that material weakness exists. If so, this could result in a restatement of the previously issued financial statements.
Yeah, that's right. And if anybody's gone through a restatement before, we know that's a lot of work. So another reason for the auditor to make sure that they're performing sufficient procedures. And for those registrants in the audience, right, to make sure that you're providing the needed evidence to the auditor to help them out. So to sum up what we've talked about, although the PCAOB doesn't directly impact registrants, there can be some indirect impacts, and making sure you understand what those are as you work with your auditors and that you're providing support, so information in support of their opinion.
On the right side of this slide, you have highlighted the PCAOB key areas focused in 2022 for inspections. Each year, the PCAOB provides a preview on the areas they expect to focus their attention in the upcoming inspection cycle. They haven't yet released the 2023 key focus area, but we expect them to be similar to the 2022 focus area. Speaking of inspection themes, we want to briefly share recent PCAOB inspection trends. Over the past 3 years of PCAOB findings across the auditing firms in the US, the PCAOB has identified deficiencies during their inspections. As you can see on the slide, the revenue has been the area of frequency inspection finding, which 1/3 of all audits inspected having deficiencies. Other common area which deficiencies are expected credit losses and inventory.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the survey results of just kind of knowing where the PCAOB was finding issues. And Rodrigo, as you just said, like there's some trends here on the issues that they find. And in a speech at the AICPA conference that Ghislaine was talking about, Chair Williams spoke, and she talked about inspections and the increase in deficiencies. She stated that 1/3 of the audits inspected had deficiencies of such significance that PCAOB staff believe the audit firm failed to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence to support its opinion on the financial amounts or internal controls. And she commented that firms must sharpen their focus and prioritize their efforts to increase audit quality and ensure investors are protected.
Chair Williams' comments and the focus on inspection and increase in sanctions will likely result in increased requests from auditors in that effort to improve quality in their audits.
Yeah, and before we leave this slide, just one more comment on it, and that is that we expect similar types of criticisms will continue over the future inspection cycles. In addition, we're noting that auditing deficiencies of the statement of cash flows and earnings per share are trending upwards in inspection findings. So that's just something to look out for in the future.
Before we move off the topic of inspections, we thought it might be helpful to show you an example of inspection findings. These findings came directly from PCAOB inspection report of the firm. The finding is in goodwill and relate to management's control on significant assumptions used to estimate of the fair value for the CGU or reporting unit. Management's control consistent in reviewing the significant assumptions in the cash flow forecast. However, the firm didn't evaluate the specific review procedures that the control owners performed to assess the reasonableness of these assumptions.
Yeah, and this is a good one to bring up because it's very typical, and it links back to what we said about the need for the auditor to remediate the inspection findings. So the audit firm that received this, in order to remediate it, they will likely need to enhance their understanding of the actual control activities that are being performed over those significant assumptions. And this will include what is that control owner actually doing? What level of precision is being applied to their review? What kind of questions are they asking? What kind of challenges are they providing? How do they really identify whether that assumption is reasonable, and what data or third-party reports may be used in the control? And when the auditor performs these activities, we've got one or two things that could occur. So first outcome is they could find that management actually does have effective control in place to prevent or detect errors. When they were doing their audit, they just didn't understand it well, and they didn't obtain the appropriate evidence of its effective design and operation. So in this case, they perform the remediation procedures, they document those procedures, and then they likely conclude that there's no impact to previously issued audited financial and the audited opinion and the related financial statements and disclosures. Now, the second outcome isn't the best, and that is that they find that management's controls actually aren't designed or operating effectively in order to prevent or detect errors in that significant assumption. And so in this case, they may determine that a material weakness exists. And assuming that they had issued an opinion on the effectiveness of management's internal controls, they may need to amend that opinion to identify the material weakness. And that would also result in an amendment to management's report on internal controls over financial reporting in item 15.
Yes, and if the additional audit work found that the assumptions were not reasonable, it could result in identified error, and we need to restate the financial statement amounts. Therefore, another reason to help the auditors understand their controls as well as provide evidence of their effective operation.
Yeah, and so maybe just to summarize that, it's so important for both management and the auditor to work together in making sure that the correct information is provided, obtained, and understood. So let me just finish by providing some key reminders related to controls and financial reporting. So the first one that's on here. We've all heard of the Great Resignation and that turnover of staff at many companies. And if you're experiencing employee turnover, maybe think about how that impacts financial reporting. So who will perform the controls or financial reporting process of the employee who resigned or left? Will those responsibilities be handed to a new employee that's taking their place, or will it be done by other employees that are still at your firm? Will the same level of rigor be performed by the new individual performing that activity? And then along those similar lines, the second reminder is that many in the workforce have been working remotely over the past couple of years. And as employees transition back to the office or work on a hybrid basis, consider what impact this may have on controls and financial reporting. You want to ensure consistency in financial reporting and a smooth transition back to the office and how those controls actually work. And that can prevent, as long as you're providing that smooth transition, it can prevent issues in design or operation of controls and errors in financial reporting. And then as Valerie discussed, climate change is a focus for many investors and regulators. So consider how climate change is affecting your company and how your company may be affecting climate change. And for areas where provisions may need to be recorded or where cash flow forecasts are affected, consider how that process you have for developing the estimates may need to change, or what data points you may need in order to make those estimates. And then lastly, just depending on a company's industry, location, your customer and your supplier diversification, you may be experiencing both direct and indirect impacts from the macroeconomic and geopolitical conditions. So the severity and duration of any or all of these trends could have a significant impact on a number of assets and liabilities. And this may result in a need for a registrar to modify their controls, to add additional controls, or to change the precision level of certain controls, or add different control activities in order to make sure they're all accounted for correctly. So don't lose sight of any changes that are needed because of current changes that are happening in the business. So with that, Kieran, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks very much, Dan. I was just thinking here during your presentation, the fact that as you mentioned in the example of the PCAOB finding, whenever PCAOB makes findings, normally the auditor has to go back to the company, reevaluate, and on items such as goodwill testing, that's a typical area that companies may even contract third parties to do it, and they don't document, or they maybe don't document as well as they should, the process of internal review of those assumptions. And now, I guess that combined with this item of the PCAOB starting to mention the name of registrants, I mean, what could you, because typically the I guess registrants have not been that concerned about the PCAOB because they haven't, I guess, been named and haven't had a direct impact. And do you see this change as maybe having now these changes at the PCAOB that could have a greater impact on the registrants?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and one that we're not sure exactly what kind of impact the fact that registrants are being named more frequently in these sanctions. We don't know what kind of impact that could have. That remains to be seen. Maybe on your first point of getting an expert to help you with certain really difficult estimates or certain really difficult areas of the accounting, I would say that it's very common. We see that a lot. And what management needs to keep in mind is, even though you've hired an expert to help you with these estimates or certain areas of accounting, you're still responsible for it, right? So they may help you with the calculation, but management still needs to make sure that they're looking at it, they're reviewing it, and that they're happy with it, because management still knows a lot more about the business than a third party ever would that you've contracted. So making sure that that is sensible, what they've come up with, and it aligns with the data that management is seeing is really important. So maybe I hit those two questions a little bit separately. So hopefully that answered what you were going with, Kieran.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. And we've got some questions that come in here. One from Adriana Caetano, who's asking, I think maybe Ghislaine, this is for you. When assessing materiality, the analysis needs to be cumulative, thinking about previous years. When we look at qualitative, we need to consider the previous year too.
It's a good question. So I think materiality is a key topic, right, as we said. And when you're in the SEC world, we definitely look at 3 years of P&L, usually, or income statement. So if you identify an error, first of all, in this reporting period, you have to assess whether that errors belong to this period, who was an error that impacts prior period. And to answer that question, I would say you have to look what had not been recorded in the prior year. So if you have like items that were in your sum, yes, you have to consider them on a cumulative basis for like whatever is your balance sheet position at the end of this reporting period. So you might have to look at the cumulative aspect from an Iron Curtain standpoint. I'm meaning what is at the end of 2022, all the errors that have not been recorded and what is the impact there. But you have to look as well from a rollover, if you were to correct each item in the reporting period that they belong, so 22, 21, 20 in my example, what is the impact for that, right? So can you hold an error, or can you adjust everything in 22, or do you have to push it back and restate the prior years because it's too big in the current period? So the short answer is you have to look at both. What is the cumulative as of like the year end, and what is the impact on each reporting period? And I always recommend, that's why it's much better to make sure, and that's usually what we see a lot in the US, is to have like what we refer as a clean sum, meaning no adjustments left in the sum at each reporting period, right? So adjust as you go. Because whenever you have, it may becomes, it was immaterial at the end of 21, but now you have more items that you're finding, and suddenly you have to push it back and then reopen, your prior years because it's too big to correct in the current year. So definitely something to think about from a standpoint of assessment.
Great, Ghislaine, thanks very much. And Adriana also asked the question here, I think for Valerie, in relation to climate change. Having the requirement to disclose the impacts in the financial statements resulting from severe weather, let's say in 2024, would it be necessary to present comparative figures? And if so, does the company need to have the number and respective controls to obtain that information for the prior year, 2023? So, and maybe even like if we're talking about registrants here, they normally present 3 years and maybe even the 22 as well. So I guess, Valerie, in terms of the potentially the initial application of these of presentation of this information in the financial statements, would the expectation be that it would be presented for the comparative years as well?
So it's an interesting question, and I wish it was a bit of a simpler answer. As the SEC rule is proposed right now, it would apply to the comparative periods. We and many others suggested that it be on a prospective basis, meaning that if your first reporting is in 2024, we would advocate for only 2024 information and the comparative to be added in subsequent years. However, as it's currently written, it would require all periods presented. So that would be 3 years for metrics related to the income statement and 2 years related to the balance sheet detail for most companies. Now, they do say with regard to the emissions disclosures that the prior year information for emissions only needs to be provided if it's reasonably available, or if it can be created without undue cost or effort. So it's interesting that they put that qualifier on the emissions disclosures when there is an overall SEC rule applicable to all registrants and all detail, is that even required information does not need to be presented if it would take undue cost and effort to accumulate it. So there might be an argument for omitting prior years. As it's currently written, it would be required for prior years, but we're hoping that the final rule will be written to only require prospective.
Great, thanks very much, Valerie. I guess, Ghislaine, coming back to you, maybe could you tell us a bit about the expectation about new regulation on cybersecurity and what have you seen this year?
Sure. So a few things on cybersecurity. As I said, there's a proposed rule that is, on the dock here, and that we're expecting in the short term now. That being said, we have seen an increase of cybersecurity incidents, and so I would definitely say that a registrant should wait for the proposed rule to think about the reporting of cybersecurity incidents and impact on the financial statement and potential controls. This is definitely, I've seen a lot more this year disclosed, including the timely disclosure. So for FPI, it will be considering whether it's a material information to disclose to the market in a 6K. So there's no really, there's a guidance and disclosure guidance from the SEC that dates like 2011, so it's a bit old, but it has a principle of what the SEC thinks about disclosing, where it impacts, risk factors, the potential impact of accounting. And so I still recommend that look at that. And then if there was an incident, then that is material and it could be viewed as material for an investor and could have material impact on the financial statement. Definitely then something to update as well to in your 20F and your reporting of any changes or assessments from that. So definitely don't wait for the rules to think about cyber.
And what about the enforcement and whistleblower? Because I guess the every time we discuss whistleblower, a lot of people seem it seems to be a very attractive option for people just to directly ring the regulator, the SEC, and provide information on the company in the hope of gaining millions.
Yeah, no, you're right, Kieran. It's a very it's an important one where the whistleblower program has been very key, and it's still very key for the SEC. I call it the bounty hunter program, right? Is you refer to something and you will get rewarded if it results into an enforcement decision. So the enforcement is always, I don't like to scare people either, right? But I think it's important to look at the enforcement to see a little bit like the tone and what's happening. And this year, there's, as I said, a lot of the enforcement decision has been made and more penalties. And the key message I got from looking at the report and then the announcements of which decisions were made, I think two things that I think are relevant for everyone. First, I don't hope anyone is involved in an enforcement decision, but the first is the SEC is definitely after the controls, right? And sometimes it's not because of the incident itself or the fraud or anything, it's what the controls. It's easier, or a lot of the enforcement decisions have been around controls and what were the controls or the timely reporting and transparency of it. The other thing I've seen a lot more, which is interesting for this audience, a lot more corporations featuring regulators. So it's not unusual now that you see in the enforcement decision that, the Brazilian regulator is listed with the SEC and another potential regulator. So they've been trying to do a lot more coordinations on it. So that's another very important, and the trend is going up more than anything on that. And then finally, I would say that there's a lot about individual accountability. So it's a very key thing from the SEC enforcement program at this point. They're really trying to make sure that, individuals are taking ownership of that, even if they were not directly involved in there. So in fiscal 2022, Kieran, 2/3 of the SEC enforcement actions involve at least one individual defendant or respondent, which is quite interesting to me. And there is definitely ensure more about accountability for senior executive of public companies to prevent, misconduct in the firm. So in 2022, you can see several executives that have been, charged and ordered to actually return bonuses and compensation following misconduct from the firm. So something. And even if they were not personally involved in the misconduct, right, but as part of their role as an executive to it. So more focus about that as well.
Thanks very much, Galene and Diana, maybe you can tell us a bit about the importance of the PCOB for the FPIs and in relation to these previous items on enforcement, how these could impact the FPIs as well.
Yeah, well, because of the increase in these enforcement actions, right? And it's probably enforcement coupled with however they treat inspections on a go-forward basis. As with anything, sometimes it really starts with the auditors, and as the auditors get more pressure to from the regulator, then those auditors will then start asking more questions from the registrants. So that you'll feel that cascading effect as we all try to step up our game, I guess I'll call it, to what the regulators are expecting. And as Chair Williams has said in several speeches since she's been the chair, she's really focused on investor protections. And that's the whole purpose behind what she's doing. And those investors' protections include making sure the auditors are doing the right thing. And of course, the auditors are trying to make sure that companies are doing the right thing. So it's just this cascading effect.
Yeah. And maybe could you give us an example, for example, how the PCOB interacts with the auditors and then how that would have the kick on a follow-on impact for companies?
Yeah, sure. So there's four ways that they primarily regulate the auditors. So the first is through registration. So anybody that wants to, a registrant that's registered with the SEC or in the US, you have to have an audit that's done by on PCOB standards. In order to issue a PCOB audit, you have to be registered with the PCOB. And as part of their enforcement activities, some of that is looking at the auditors and making sure that they're all registered. And that includes not only the auditors that are actually signing the opinion, but if you use another auditor in another location. So for example, if your business had locations throughout South America, and so your auditor needed to engage another auditor in a different location. So for example, you're in Brazil, there's locations in Peru, there's locations in Argentina, Uruguay. So all over South America, they instead of going there themselves, they might engage another auditor. So there's been some pressure on making sure that that auditor that they're engaged, if they're performing a substantial role, which is defined by the PCOB, that those auditors are registered as well. So that's the first thing that they do, is that registration requirement. The second thing is inspection, which we talked about. And as those inspections get more rigorous, that will also cause the auditors to get more rigorous in their questions to registrants. And so you'll feel that as well. We've got standard setting, which is another way that they regulate the auditors through the rules that they actually put in place. And so depending on how those rules are laid out, then that could also in fact affect the audits and as that cascading effect the registrants. And then lastly, we talked about enforcement, and we're seeing a lot of enforcement cases. Rodrigo and I talked about a few of those enforcement cases, but even since that speech where we had the quotes, there's been an increasing amount of enforcement, and some of that enforcement is in how is on the use of unregistered firms, like we've talked about. It's on firms not providing the correct information to the PCOB, but we also saw one which I thought was interesting of the firm not doing the correct audit procedures. And typically we see that in the inspection instead of the enforcement. But in this particular case, I think because it was so egregious, there was actually an enforcement action, and the audit partner got fined a significant amount.
Oh, thanks very much, Dan. And Valerie, I guess asking you some questions on this new proposed climate change rule. I think you already mentioned in terms of when we would expect the regulation to be finalized. And I think we talked about, I guess, if they were talking about doing this, if the expectation was that this was going to come out in December, applicable for 2023, I guess is the expectation then that if it comes out in the next month or so, that then it would be applicable for 2024, then basically would you expect that timetable that you presented to be moved forward by a year? would that be the best guess at this time?
That would be my best guess. So I would expect the first tranche to be large accelerated filers, so that if the rule comes out this quarter as we expect, I would expect it would be effective January 1st of 24. So you would include it first in your 2024 20F as a large accelerated filer with an additional year delay for accelerated filers.
Okay, and I guess if an FPI is subject to reporting regulation due to other standards, be it European or the ISSB standards, would they have all of the information that they're going to require for their Form 20F, or is this going to be something that the FPIs, regardless, because this regulation is so comprehensive, like 500 pages of regulation, that regardless as to whether you prepare reports for the other regulators, you're going to have to do a significant amount of work to meet the SEC requirements?
So there's a couple of ways to address that. The first is that currently there is no provision for equivalency. So right now, although we advocated for it, as did others, there was a suggestion that the SEC permit those who need to file, for example, if they follow the climate standard for the ISSB, that be deemed to be sufficient for SEC reporting purposes, but only for a portion of those disclosures. So as I mentioned, you have the non-financial statement disclosures, and then you have the financial statement disclosures. The financial statement is unique to the SEC. So even if the SEC permits equivalency, meaning you could include your ISSB climate disclosures in lieu of the climate disclosures required by Regulation SK, we would expect the SEC would require, in addition, the footnote disclosures relative to the severe weather events. So it could be a equivalency plus, meaning that your disclosures for other jurisdictions could meet a portion of the SEC requirement, but at a minimum, we would expect you would additionally need to look at your footnote disclosures. Now, it may not work in the reverse either. There's a different way of assessing materiality under the EU rules. So even if you gather the information for your SEC requirements, it is unlikely that just the SEC rules would be equivalent for reporting in the EU. So whether you have all of the information that you need at your disposal, a lot of that is going to be very facts and circumstances specific to a company. We do recommend that companies focus not so much on the individual reporting standards, but because there are so many jurisdictions that are requiring similar disclosures, it may be easier to look at the quality of the data centrally, and then to access that data regardless of the report it needs to be included in. So for example, you focus on the quality of your emissions disclosures centrally, and then that same information could be included in your European report, in an ISSB report, in the SEC report, in a sustainability report under the GHG protocol, et cetera. So I definitely cannot say that working on the other jurisdictions would satisfy all of the requirements for the SEC, but I think companies will find that there is a reasonable degree of overlap between the requirements.
And I guess we've seen like this climate proposal appears to be a huge challenge for the FPIs, but you know that's just one area, and we've seen that the Europeans have issued more, you know, are looking at more than proposals for more than 10 standards. Is it likely that the SEC will continue down the ESG route and cover other areas? And if so, do you have any idea as to what the sequence or what areas would come next?
So part of that remains to be seen. Definitely from an ISSB standpoint, they have two standards out currently. One is on climate and one is all other environmental items. And they're working on additional standards. From a CSRD or the European Union perspective, there are 12 standards that address climate as one of them, but also address pollution, water, biodiversity, relationship with local communities. So a much broader scope of sustainability topics than just the climate that is the central focus of the SEC disclosure. The SEC is also coming out with disclosures under cyber, as we mentioned, which some consider under the sort of governance element of ESG. They are also working on more prescriptive rules on top of the principles-based rules on human capital, which some consider under the S, or the social element of ESG. So those are the next two that we think will come out. Whether they expand to biodiversity or water pollution, currently we're not aware of projects that are in the works on those topics, but obviously it doesn't preclude them from expanding the scope further on. But I would not expect those in the short term.
Thanks very much, Valerie. And maybe Ghislaine, we have a question here that came in from Roger Bessa. He's asking regarding crypto assets disclosure and presentation in the financial statements. What are the main differences between IFRS and SAB 121, and how are the auditors assessing potential differences in accounting treatment and implications on the audit report? I guess the SEC having issued the SAB 121 on their interpretation of cyber of crypto assets and the expectation that would be applied for IFRS, I guess has generated noise in the market. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Thanks, Kieran. I think it's a very interesting question. It's a complicated question, so I'm not sure I can, I'm happy to have a separate discussion as well on it for further detail, because it's not as easy as it could sound on this one, to your point, because there's a lot of noise in the system there. First, I should say, most of the SAB are usually not applicable to IFRS filers, right? So a lot of the SAB, because the SABs are usually viewed as interpretation of accounting and interpretation of US GAAP. So most of the SABs are not, but there's now a few SABs. So I would caution the IFRS filers that there's few SABs that are actually applicable, right? We talked about SAB 99, that is the case. And yes, SAB 121 mention IFRS filers specifically to say that it is applicable to IFRS filers. So what is the difference? It's mostly a gross up balance sheet difference, right, between that SAB 121 and IFRS. The expectation from the SEC is that you apply SAB 121 and that you are in compliance with IFRS IASB. Is there any implication for the auditor's report? I think it has to be case by case and what the transaction, because you could get to the same answer under IFRS, and if you're not, we should discuss that further. And then if you have a transaction that comes and where you have to apply SAB 21, it definitely requires a little bit more discussion because each transaction is quite specific in there. But the expectation is if you come to the SEC and you have crypto and you're in that guidance, yes, SAB 121 will apply and we need to understand that.
Great. And in terms of errors, maybe could you explain to us the difference between the concept of a big R and a little r?
Sure. So it sounds like we had a lot of question and discussion on materiality, and as Val mentioned, it implies this word materiality, traditional concept. And so clawback mentioned restatement, right? And one thing that I should have said, and we can go into what if people have questions, is it applies to big R and little r, right? When I mentioned the clawback. So there's a lot of discussion. So what does that mean? So first of all, when you have prior adjustments that are identified in prior years or in current years, you have three ways to correct, right? You have a restatement, you have a revision, and if it belongs to a prior period, it might be an out-of-period adjustment. What is a big R? So big R is when it's material to the previously financial statement audited that you have to take out the reliance upon. So the PCAOB report cannot be relied upon, the previous financial statement cannot be relied upon because they're materially restated. Or you have a material errors in the current period for some reason that you may have not thought there, so needs to be adjusted and could be, there will be a mention in the audit report. a revision, the little r, right? It doesn't really appear anyway, but that's the way in the accounting world we refer to it, is that the previously financial statement can still be relied upon, right? They're not materially restated. But if you were to correct the adjustment, let's say in this period, it will be material. So you have to push it back to 21 in my example, little r. And in this, but you only correct in the next time you have to present those financial statements. So now you identified in 2022, you identify an error. It belongs to 21. You assess 21, whether 21 was materially wrong. You said no, but you can't correct it in 22 because it belongs to 21 and it would be too big. It would change the result of 22. So you have to push it back in 21. In that case, it will be a revision, but you will adjust only in your next 20th in this current period, right? So that's a little r. And then I mentioned the out of period. The out of period will be, okay, I found something, it belongs to 21. It's really small and insignificant. I can just correct it in my period in 2022 to make sure that, back to our discussion on, cumulative errors, I still have no errors at the end of 22. Everything was, from a balance standpoint, corrected. So hopefully that answers and clarify, Karen, but if anything else on the R and little r, right? So rely upon, mentioned in the auditor's report, and it's definitely something, but the disclosure I should have mentioned, sorry, Karen, one more thing is when you have a restatement, whether it's a revision or big R or little r, the expectation is very similar in terms of disclosure though, right? Is you follow IS 8 there for the correction, and you will expect to see what was the financials prior to the adjustment, and then the amount corrected in a footnote. So it's very similar from that standpoint in what we will see in the disclosure there.
I guess that's a good point, Gilly. We've seen a lot of companies who maybe typically alter comparative information without wanting to disclose why it's been altered because it's not considered, if you like, a big R. But as you said, like all alterations should be disclosed.
Yeah, maybe you should definitely, except if it was so insignificant for whatever reason. But I doubt that too many will change their prior numbers issued to the market without like some reasons, right? So. And then maybe one more thing is that in the big R and the restatement, that's when you will see a column labeled restated, right? You would not see that if it was a revision or something. You would have a footnote, you would explain that. But the big R is where you have to label every footnote that is restated and be very clear of the restatement as well. And of course, you need to think about whether it's an out of period, a revision, or a big R about controls. And that will keep me honest how many discussion we have on that. But you have to think about controls and, whether there is any material weaknesses to be reported. And it could be a material weakness was a revision because the issue could have been bigger, right? So it might not be material to restate there the prior year and just correct when you issue your next reporting, but you might still have a material weakness to report.
And could you expand a bit on the clawback rules and what the FPIs should be thinking about and the implications for them?
Sure. So it's a great transition because, now if you have an error, we just talked about big R and little r, you have with this new rule, which is again has been adopted and that we expect to be applicable really for the next reporting period, you have to have a policy to claw back potentially if it impacted the compensation. And reason I think it's important to think about it this year is because it goes back to the errors for the prior 3 years. So really, if you have errors this year or the prior year, next year you may have to think about it whenever, if you find an error related to those, period we are preparing right now. It applies to FPI again, right? So I think it's important. And the one thing that I thought was very interesting as well in looking at the rule is that it has a very broad term of what an executive officer is. So who do you have to actually claw back? So it's very more inclusive than the general definition of the term we usually see under other SEC rules. And the new rule, right, the term executive officer is defined as the issuer president, the principal financial officer, the principal accounting officer, or the controllers. There's no principal accounting officer. any vice president in charge of a principal business unit, division of function, and then any other officers or person who performs a policy-making function. So hopefully like a lot of people here might be like starting to be like, I might meet that definition, right? So this is something to really think about and start looking, because, do you have a policy? Do you need to revise your policy? And it will be needed to be filed as an exhibit. And there will be a disclosure requirement that will get into, to put that as an exhibit in the 20F or the 10K. And then you will have 2 new boxes that will be on the cover sheet of the 20F starting next year for that, whether you had any revision and whether you had any pullback there. So definitely something to put. Not too scared though, if you do a voluntary revision, not like because of an error, like a changing accounting policy or a segment change, that doesn't apply. You will not have to, change as long as it was not. It's really driven by the errors correction.
Great, thanks very much, Ghislaine. And Diana, maybe for you, we have a question that came in here from Adriana Caetano asking about regarding remote work. Has the PCOB issued any comments, for example, issues on the audit resulting from the inspection that lately, for example, lack of procedures that have been done by auditors? I'm guessing this is in relation to the pandemic, and I guess have the challenges of people working remotely maybe limited what the auditors should be doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one, I guess I would say, just to level set, when the PCAOB does inspections, it takes some time for their reports to come out. And we're just starting to see those the inspection reports on those inspections for the audits that took place in 2020. So that first wave of when a lot of us were working remotely. And in those reports, and I think that the question has it right of, what are they actually showing, and of what the auditors did or didn't do, right? And it's really anchored in what the standards say. And the standards, there's not a lot on how you do things remotely, right? The standards are really focused on how do you supervise others, how do you get evidence. And so if they see something, a deficiency in the audit because people weren't supervised appropriately, for example, because they were remote working, the finding is going to be on lack of supervision of the team. And usually that lack of supervision results in a audit procedure that wasn't done, right? So they're going to focus on the audit procedure that wasn't done. Or if you've got component teams, right, they might focus on did the group team really know what the component team was doing? How did they supervise them? Did they have regular visits with them? Did they have regular communications and calls? Did they look at the reports that the component auditor has issued? When you think about some of the remote working that we had to do, for example, on inventory counts, where sometimes we couldn't get access to those warehouses or to where the inventory was being located because of the pandemic, there was some remote working that took place there with videos and things of that nature. As far as the reports themselves and what we're seeing on themes for those that have been released thus far, there's not a lot of themes in the reports, or you can't tell in the reports whether the issue arose because of remote working. But what is interesting is when you look at, whenever the report comes out, there usually is a response from the audit firm of the fact that they understand the comments, they appreciate the PCAOB providing those comments and showing them where they need to improve. And in some of those letters from the audit firms, they do indicate that they're going to step up that level of supervision and review, particularly the coaching that's provided when you've got remote working. So that's what we're seeing. Just on the company side, which I'd mentioned before, right? When you do have controls that exist because people are together, and then you go into remote setting and those controls have to change, sometimes we are seeing a little bit in those findings of the auditors really not understanding that a control has changed and what additional evidence or modified evidence they may need to get because that control changed.
Thanks, Diana. And I guess we discussed errors and maybe if you could remind us in terms of what is expected, I guess, in terms of evaluation of errors, especially whenever errors are identified and you know, we talk about the SAB 99 and how are these unadjusted errors analyzed, and you know, what's the potential implication on controls for those errors?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so Ghislaine covered a lot of that first part of those errors. How do you evaluate them based on big R versus little r? When we think about errors, when there's an error in the financial statement, it usually indicates that a control failed. Now, a control can fail even, and there could be no error, but typically when there is an error, that means a control did fail. And so auditors will often have to link that failure, or link that error, to the control that actually failed, and then evaluate those failures both individually and in aggregate to determine whether there could be either a significant deficiency that needs to be reported to the audit committee or a material weakness that would be reported to both the audit committee and also in management's report, or if the auditor's doing an internal controls opinion, it would be in the audit opinion as well.
Thanks, Diana. And Valerie, I guess a lot, I see we had a question here coming in terms of some companies been asking us about would it be appropriate in the financial statements to not only talk about risks related to climate change and the impacts of climate change, but also opportunities and potential upside, and what can we expect in terms of the SEC comment letter and opportunities? I mean, in Brazil, we have a large agribusiness sector, and a lot of companies, you know, see this as potential opportunity.
Yeah, I actually should have mentioned this. In the part of the financial statements, the requirement is to disclose your climate-related risks, and it does say that you can disclose your opportunities. And I think disclosing the opportunities is appropriate within the part to the extent that that's generally forward-looking information. However, the important differentiator is when you look at the footnotes on the impact of severe weather. That calculation, when I mentioned that it is the total impact of severe weather based on a 1% threshold of the individual financial statement line item, that impact is both the positive and the negative impacts added together on an absolute value basis. So if you have a benefit from severe weather events, if you are in flood mitigation business, if there's I had one client who asked me the question that there is an increase in takeout food and in certain sweets and candies during severe weather events and snowstorms in the Northeast. Does that count as a benefit to severe weather? But if you have a benefit from severe weather, you would need to add it together again on an absolute value basis. And that could include insurance recovery. So there's some interpretation required, and it's not entirely clear, but it could be that if you have an insured loss that's covered, you would need to account both the loss as well as the benefit added together, almost double counting it for determining the 1% threshold. So I think that the place to discuss opportunities related to climate risk is in the part of the financial statements, but from a footnote, you are definitely required to consider the positive elements of climate-related events.
Great. Valerie, I think we're coming up on our time here, and I'm just wondering if you want to give any sort of final thoughts or comments, and especially in relation to what companies should be thinking about for this year end, because we're seeing a lot of changes coming down the line, and I guess the companies are now in their closing for their December 22 year ends, and any comments in terms of what they should be thinking about?
I think that we've discussed a little bit about the sort of the plans. One thing I would say is to be conscious of the disclosures. The SEC is, as I mentioned earlier, focused on the current securities laws and the nature of disclosures that are made in the sustainability report. So I would say maybe one of the biggest items is to make sure that those in external reporting are aware of what's being said in the sustainability report, not only from a disclosure standpoint, just the nature of the disclosures, but also the quality of the information. A lot of times the information in external reports that are not filed with regulators may have not as robust a controls process or a documentation process. And that definitely you want to get your hands around to the extent that that data will be needed in your financial reports on a prospective basis. So it could be a good time to start implementing some of the controls and the data quality evaluation around those disclosures, because the other thing you don't want is to disclose emissions in the current year in your sustainability report. And then once you evaluate it and look at the controls and the process, to have a different number reported in your SEC filing on a prospective basis. So I'd say definitely start planning, but more immediate for this year-end close is probably around data quality and that sustainability report.
Great, thanks very much, Valerie. And Diane, any final comments in terms of PCOB issues?
Not other than what we've covered. I don't think I've got anything else. I would just say, the rigors increase. We expect the rigor to increase, so just be prepared for it.
Yeah, I guess that's interesting theme. That from what you were saying, it appears that I guess the rigor at the PCOB is changed. The auditors are going to get tougher questions, and thus will be putting, if they're getting more pressure, then it's likely the companies will be getting more pressure coming from that. And this is even despite changes in standards. So it's even, companies may see a significant change in demands for information and controls, despite the fact that maybe the rules haven't changed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. The PCOB is looking at changing some of the rules or trying to update their standards. So we do expect some of those changes to come through. But in the near term, until those new standards are effective, I would say just that we will expect some more rigor, even though those standards have not yet changed or are not yet effective.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Dana. And Ghislaine, any final comments?
Thanks, Kieran. I think we covered a lot, so hopefully no one is overwhelmed there. I think for this year end, right, there is some proposed rules, there's some adopted rules, and there's more comments as well there, as we talked about. So my final word would be ensure transparency, but transparency doesn't mean always more disclosure, right? Sometimes it's just actually focus on we talked a lot of material, being clear and transparent, what is really material to the financial statements of my company, being precise. When I see too many critical accounting estimate, I'm like, so everything is an accounting estimate, right? Or is everything like an issue here? Are we really giving transparent disclosure and focus to the investors? So, and of course, if you haven't checked, especially for the SEC filers, with all the environment that goes, it's been changing, the capital market, the market cap, your FPI status, just make sure that you do a final check, right? That there is no surprise from that. I always get few that get surprised at year end that they didn't really check properly the status of their reporting requirement, and there could be consequences, and it's not the last minute things to do. So good timing to as well just make sure there is no surprise from your status or any additional requirement that may be applicable to you. And of course, reach out for any questions to your engagement teams as well.
Great, thanks very much, Ghislaine. I guess with that, we've arrived at the end of our webcast for today. And now comes the most important part, is to know who has won the chocolate today.
Hi, Kieran. Thank you. Obrigado, pessoal, pela participação de todas e de todos. Hoje foi a senhora Adriana Caetano, de São Paulo. Peço que aguarde um contato nosso. Obrigado e parabéns.
Okay, so Adriana Caetano from São Paulo won the chocolate. Thanks for, well done, Adriana. We'll get in contact and send you the chocolate. I guess with that, our webcast is finished. For those Brazilians that are accompanying us and they'd like this to have this registered as training for CRC purposes, we have the requirement to have an exam, to have a test. So we'll just phase in now to, we're going to run a video just to give a countdown and make sure everyone's online, and then do the test for the Brazilian CRC purposes. So I think, and then we'll just switch to Portuguese while we're doing that. So many thanks for everyone for the comments and for all our speakers today. And I guess with that, we'll now we're going to run the video to make sure everyone's tuned in for our final questions for Brazilian purposes. Acho que vamos trocar para português. Agora deveria estar aparecendo para vocês, para fins da prova para registrar o treinamento, para fins do CRC, as perguntas sobre sobre o nosso evento de hoje. E aí você vai ver as perguntas que estão chegando as perguntas estão chegando em português. A primeira pergunta é: qual que é o tópico que o ESG, que a ACC emitiu uma proposta de divulgação, ou seja, qual que era o tema específico de ESG que o SEC emitiu uma proposta, pobreza, fome, saúde, educação, água, saneamento, o clima. E aí você tem que acertar 3 de 4 perguntas. Então, se você não acertar a primeira vez, não se preocupa que vai ser repetido as 4 perguntas. Então, já estão rodando as perguntas para fins da prova final, para fins do registro do treinamento para fins do CRC. Aí, talvez só repassando o que tivemos hoje em termos de apresentação. Hoje tivemos apresentação sobre as empresas, os requerimentos de empresas listadas nos Estados Unidos. Então, a importância do ambiente regulatório norte-americano é o maior mercado de capitais do mundo e que existe faz mais tempo e que tem um nível de sofisticação maior que qualquer mercado de capitais que eu conheço, pelo menos. E aí, com isso, muitas vezes as normas do mercado americano acabam tendo impacto cascata nas outras implicações. E hoje falamos sobre um volume grande de alterações de regulamentação. Você pode ver pelas publicações, acho que deve ter pelo menos 15 publicações, e ali eu não coloquei todas. A gente já colocou uma lista das mais importantes alterações que tiveram na regulamentação norte-americana este ano. E aí falamos de regulamentações sobre medições non-GAAP measures, falamos sobre itens de cibersegurança, falamos sobre itens as cartas do SEC fez sobre cibersegurança, sobre temas do clima, e discutimos as principais áreas das cartas comentárias da SEC, como área de segmento, área de acho que as áreas do non-GAAP. Discutimos também sobre as normas do PCAOB, que é o regulador sobre os auditores. A gente percebeu que o PCAOB está tomando uma postura mais rigorosa sobre os auditores, que vai ter um impacto cascata em termos das empresas listadas na SEC, porque uma vez estão cobrando maior nível de prova dos auditores, que os auditores vão cobrar um maior nível de prova das empresas. E é interessante, quando você entra no detalhe dessas questões, você pode perceber o nível de sofisticação que tem sobre os temas sendo discutidos. E aí tivemos uma discussão também sobre a proposta de clima. Essa proposta é 500 páginas, foi recebido milhares de cartas sobre a proposta, as alterações são profundas. As alterações impactam as demonstrações financeiras, impactam também no restante do documento do restante do 20F. Aí estamos discutindo o escopo, as emissões da empresa, emissões da empresa de quem compra energia, também emissões da cadeia de valor inteira via escopo 3. Discutimos o fato que essas expectativas seria que a norma seja emitida esse trimestre, a gente imagina que seria com aplicação para o ano que vem, e aí você teria um grande volume de informações sendo requeridas com a possibilidade de requerer informações comparativas. E aí, combinado com isso, tem o requisito também de relatório de seguração sobre essas informações. Então, é um novo ambiente de captação de informações em termos das informações sendo captadas, o SEC tem sido muito detalhado e a gente deu alguns exemplos aqui hoje do nível do detalhe. Esses foram os principais itens que discutimos hoje. Talvez só lembrando para todo mundo que semana que vem estamos de volta no nosso horário normal, às 9 horas na quarta-feira. Vamos discutir o tema da implicação da tecnologia 5G no Brasil e as oportunidades, desafios que existem com a disponibilização dessa tecnologia e o que está sendo os desafios nessa aqui, as oportunidades nas várias indústrias que estão sujeitos a essa nova tecnologia. Aí estou vendo que todo o material que a gente apresentou hoje está disponível no seu micro. Você pode pegar o tab de publicação, da apresentação, e já baixar a apresentação. Todas tem das publicações, aquelas 15 publicações que discutimos, você pode já entrar lá e baixar também. Além de nossas perguntas, tem os nossos FAQs, e como sempre tem nosso e-mail do br_perspectivas@pwc.com para você tirar suas dúvidas e interagir conosco. Aí acho que já chegamos no final aqui de nosso tempo. Acho que já foram as 4 perguntas e foram repetidas as 4 perguntas. Espero que todo mundo passou na prova e acho que com isso vamos encerrar nosso webcast por hoje. Muito obrigado para todos e até quarta-feira que vem.